Okay, so we are looking today at the second part of the crucifixion story. And before we jump in specifically to this, I want to give you a little bit of context. So as we're coming to the end of the gospel, if you've been with us for over a year, we began this about a year ago. And Mark 1:1, the opening sentence of Mark's gospel says this. It says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. This was ultimately Mark's thesis statement, that this is a book about the good news of Jesus and that Jesus is the Son of God. Now, what's interesting is the last verse in our text today, we're going to see a Roman centurion, a man who actually put Jesus on the cross, literally and physically. This guy put Jesus on the cross. We see him confessing at the end, truly, this was the Son of God. So Mark today brings us full circle with bookend statements at a very climactic moment in the story, that is the death of Jesus. The book opens with, he's the Son of God, and this part after his death ends with a man who put him on the cross saying, yes, wow, this is true. He is the Son of God. And so Christ on the cross, it's a beautiful paradox, but it is the clearest revelation of who God is, that he was the Son of God, that he was the incarnation, the full picture of who God is in the flesh. And this symbol of a cross, where we're going to see Jesus today, this has become the symbol for God's plan of salvation for the entire world, and it's at the very center of our faith. Now, if you look at any type of religion, any ideology, any philosophy, every single group of people that shares a common ideology or religion, they have some sort of symbol that represents the big idea of what that's about. Buddhism, for example, the symbol is the lotus flower. Judaism has a symbol which is the Star of David. Islam has the crescent moon as its symbol. Marxism has a hammer and a sickle. Oregon, we're a little divided. Some it's a beaver, some it's a duck, right? But at the end of the day, there is a symbol for every people group who shares certain values. That's a reality. And this is what made Christianity such a scandal in the first century. Nobody in their right mind would have ever started a religion with a cross, a man being crucified at the center of it. Because crucifixion in those days, it was so much more than just we're putting somebody to death because they've fallen short of Rome's executive orders or whatever. The cross was the ultimate symbol of humility. It was an ultimate symbol of shame. There was a philosopher named Cicero in 63 BC who said this about even the idea of the cross and how shameful it was. He said, the very word cross, even just to say it, should be far removed not only from a person of a Roman citizen, but from his thoughts, eyes, and ears. The mere mention is unworthy of a Roman citizen and a free man. So he understood, people in this context understood that a cross, it was shameful to even look at one or to even say one or think about. It was a very brutal thing. And so for the Romans, as Jesus is now being crucified on the cross, and the cross becomes the center focus of this religion that we would call Christianity, the Romans said, this is foolish. Why would you have a cross at the center of it? A dude being crucified, bringing shame upon himself. It seemed weird that that would become the symbol. For the Jews as well, the Jews felt the same way. The Jews were familiar with the Old Testament, which said, cursed is anyone who's hung on a tree. And so no biblically minded Jew could accept or wrap their mind around this idea that the Messiah would go and be crucified on a cross. It was truly unthinkable. Paul the Apostle put it this way in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23 and 24. He said, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. So again, even in the first century, he said to the Jews, this is a stumbling block. The idea that their Messiah is going on a cross. To the Greeks and the Gentiles, they just think it's foolish. What is this idea of a cross being at the center of this religion? It was foolishness. And this is again what made the cross so subversive. And this is what made it so counterintuitive in the first century. Nobody would have thought that you could start a religion or a following or an ideology analogy with a dude on ultimately a crucifixion stake at the center of it. So what this meant is either these people who were following this Messiah who went and gave his life on a cross, they were either completely insane and completely out of their minds, as most of the culture thought of them at this time, or it was true that God actually chose to rescue the world and reveal his heart and love for mankind through the self-sacrifice of his own son. It was one of the two. And we catch a picture of kind of where this goes in our story today. So if you want to look down with me at the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, let's pick up in verse 33 where we left off last week. It says, "And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour." So as Jesus is hanging there on the cross, we see that darkness falls upon the land for a 3-hour period of time. This was a supernatural falling of darkness. One commentator says it this way. I think this is a beautiful picture. "The miraculous darkening of the skies expressed the agony and grief of heaven over the death of the Son of God." So as Jesus is there, the whole land around him, it becomes pitch black. There is a grieving from the heavens, an agony from the heavens, so to speak. Now, Jesus himself alluded to this moment where the skies would be blackened and darkened in the Olivet Discourse, which we covered in Mark chapter 13. And I want to read this to you because this is important. Mark 13, verse 24 and 26, here's what Jesus said. He said, "But in those days after the tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory." Now, if you were with us in Mark 13, the coming of Jesus in the clouds is not Jesus' second coming to earth. This is a direct quote from Daniel chapter 7, where Jesus is coming to the clouds, returning to the Father in glory, returning to the Ancient of Days. And so Jesus says, before you see that, before you see me coming in the clouds to the Father, there's going to be darkness over the entire land. And this darkness that is falling as Jesus is here on the cross was an announcement that the day of the Lord had dawned and that it was the beginning of a new age. God's people at this time would have understood this with very much clarity. Now, when we see this idea of darkness coming on Jesus in the midst of judgment, if you think of this concept of darkness, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, there's probably two main stories that may come to mind when you hear the word darkness, and Mark is intentionally making these connections as well. The first story of darkness that may come to mind would be in Genesis chapter 1, which is the creation narrative. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There was darkness over the face of the deep. It was formless and void, and God spoke into the darkness. You may remember, he said, "Let there be light," and the light came and overtook the darkness. So Genesis 1 is a story of light triumphing over darkness. It is a story of order trumping over chaos, creation being made from anti-creation. And what we see here in Mark chapter 15 as Jesus is being crucified, as the Son of God is about to die, we see the undoing of creation itself. In the beginning, God spoke light into the darkness. Now we see creation rising against the Creator, darkness coming and covering the light. And this, by the way, is always what happens when we move away from God. When you move away from God, when you pull away from the Creator who said, "Let there be light," it is always a move towards darkness, emptiness, chaos, formlessness, and creation itself. So again, this moment, as darkness covers the face of the deep, it's an undoing of creation itself. Secondly, the second story that might come to mind as you think of darkness would be the story of Passover. And this is very intentional in the text because the moment Jesus is being crucified on the cross is the end of the Passover festival. So at this time, Jews came from all over to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. And in this moment, as Jesus Jesus on the cross. This is the climax of the Passover celebration, which is really cool. Now, if you're not familiar with the story of Passover, to just give you a quick overview, in the book of Exodus, the children of Israel were in slavery in Egypt. God raised up this leader by the name of Moses, and he told him, go to Pharaoh and tell Pharaoh you're going to let my people go. So Moses keeps going to Pharaoh. He's like, hey, let my people go. God's called us to go into the promised land. Pharaoh keeps saying no. And so long story short, God sends plague after plague after plague on the people of Egypt. It was there was 10 plagues. There was blood, frogs, lice, flies, all the livestock died, boils, hail and fire, locusts, and then darkness over the face of the deep. You thought 2020 was bad. We haven't seen anything, y'all. Just saying. Read the book of Exodus. So what's crazy is after all these plagues, which we don't have time to dive into, after all these plagues, though, Moses keeps going back to Pharaoh being like, let my people go. And Pharaoh keeps saying, no, I'm not going to let your people go. Now, the final plague after the plague of darkness, which was over the entire land of Egypt for 3 days, the final plague was the death of the firstborn son. So God sent in the book of Exodus what was called the angel of death, who was going to kill all the firstborn male children in the land of Egypt. And the only way that the angel of death would pass over somebody's house and spare the life of the firstborn child is if the people took a spotless lamb and they sacrificed that lamb, and they would spread that blood over the doorpost. And if they did that, if they willingly made a sacrifice, trusting in God's provision, the angel of death would pass over and the firstborn in that household would not die. And eventually they were set free out of slavery into Egypt. So what's crazy is in the progression of the plagues here, the 9th plague was darkness over the land for 3 days, followed by the death of the firstborn son for those who did not apply the blood onto their doorpost. And this is a clear foreshadowing of exactly what's happening to Jesus here on the cross. The darkness that we're seeing at Calvary for 3 hours was an announcement that the firstborn son of God was about to be crucified. This is it. The darkness and the death of the firstborn at the end of the Passover celebration. Mark is making it very clear, this is the fulfillment of the Passover. Jesus is it. Jesus is going into the darkness. Jesus is applying his blood. Jesus is the firstborn who would die. It's just, it's such a beautiful picture. And this is what Jesus was doing for us on our behalf. He was being the final sacrifice once and for all so that God's mercy and God's grace could be applied to those who apply the blood. It was apply the blood to your door. The angel of death passes over. For those in Christ who say, I want that, I trust in his finished sacrifice, we are now covered in mercy, covered in the grace of God because Jesus was the fulfillment of the Passover. Isn't that a beautiful picture? Man. Whew. I didn't know it was that heavy, but it is. It's so cool. So darkness comes over the face of the land for 3 hours. Again, fulfillment of the 3 days in Egypt, and then the death of the firstborn. Now, check it out in verse 34. At the 9th hour, after 3 hours of darkness, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? So the darkness that covered the land for 3 hours now penetrates the very heart of Jesus himself on the cross. As Jesus is on the cross, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, there is much debate and various interpretations among scholars and theologians as to what this means, that Jesus was forsaken by the Father. And there is a lot of various views as to what really is going on here. And even in studying this, I reached out to multiple of my spiritual mentors and pastors, some in the Rogue Valley, some distant, to get their thoughts on it. And even among people who I trust and respect, there was various views on this. So what we do know for certain is that Jesus, when he says this, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is a direct quote from Psalm chapter 22, verse verse 1. Direct quote from Psalm 22, verse 1, which is, by the way, Psalm 22 is a prophetic psalm about what the Messiah would go through on the cross. There's absolutely zero disagreement about that. All people believe that that's what's going on here. The main debate as to where you can kind of get into some various interpretations, the main debate is whether to consider only this small phrase that was quoted from Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me, to just focus in on that in isolation, or to weigh these words against the backdrop and the context of all of Psalm 22, which was prophetic about what the Messiah would go through on the cross. So to give you a little deeper understanding, Psalm 22, it's not only about the suffering of the Messiah, but it's also about his vindication and restoration to fellowship with God. So Psalm chapter 22 begins as a lament. It begins with, my God, why have you forsaken me? But it ends in a triumphant note of hope. So it's not just about suffering. So the way that we have to understand, how do we approach this as Jesus is saying this? Do we look at just this one quote itself, or is there something bigger happening here in Psalm 22 that's also happening in the Gospel of Mark? So to come to what I believe a biblical hermeneutical interpretation, you have to ask this question. Does the conclusion of Mark's Gospel connect or relate in any way to the rest of Psalm chapter 22? Because that's what Jesus is quoting here. So the big question, does the conclusion of Mark's Gospel connect in any way to the rest of Psalm chapter 22? I want to point out a few things for you. So if you want to turn to Psalm 22, you can. We'll have these on the slides as well here. First and foremost, I want to tell you, Psalm 22, verses 1 through 21, is clearly, indisputably about the suffering of the Messiah. If you want to read that later, all of this is about the suffering that the Messiah would prophetically go through on the cross. And it begins with, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? So the fulfillment of that the Messiah would suffer, Psalm 22, 1 through 21, is the crucifixion, what Jesus is going through right now on the cross. Everything Jesus is going through on the cross was prophesied in Psalm 22, verse 1 through 21, which is really beautiful. The second section of Psalm 22 begins in verse 27, which if you want to look down at verse 27, here's what it says. There's a transition now. He says, all the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before you. So it goes from the predicted suffering of the Messiah, which was clearly fulfilled in the crucifixion, to verse 27, which is about Gentiles coming and worshiping. He says, all the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord. The families of the nations shall come and worship you. So this was prophetically saying after the suffering, there's going to be a moment where Gentiles, families of the earth, come and worship you. And what's interesting is at the end of our story today, in verse 39, we're going to see right after Jesus' crucifixion, we see the centurion, a man who crucified Jesus, who was a Gentile, coming confessing Jesus Christ is Lord. So this was prophesied in Psalm 22. He's going to suffer. Then there are going to be Gentiles, those who come and worship from other nations. That was fulfilled in the centurion's confession. Then look at verse 28. Verse 28 is a clear picture of then the kingdom of God. Here's what it says. For kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. So not only is Jesus going to suffer, which he did, not only are Gentiles going to come and confess, which the centurion did, but he says his kingship belongs to the Lord. This is a clear picture that Jesus, after his suffering on the cross, was going to come and establish his kingship. The most amazing thing is that we see this exact thing in verse 43, which we're going to get into next week of Mark chapter 15. We see very closely that Joseph was looking and awaiting for the kingdom of God. So Psalm 22, 28 is there's going to be a kingdom coming, and we see the parallel connection of that with Joseph looking and waiting for the kingdom of God in verse 43, which is really cool. Now, verse 29, there's another shift. Look at this in verse 29 of Psalm 22. He says, all the prosperous of the earth eat and worship. Before him shall bow all who go down to the dust, even the one who could not keep himself alive. Verse 29 is emphatically about resurrection. It says, before him shall bow all who go down to the dust, meaning those who die are going to come and bow down before the Messiah, even the one who could not keep himself alive. So those who die, Psalm 22 is predicting there is going to be a resurrection. Is there any connection to that in the Gospel of Mark? Yes. Absolutely. Mark chapter 16, we see the story of the resurrection where Jesus conquers death itself and resurrects from the grave. So again, this was directly connecting to Jesus' ministry. And finally, verse 30 and 31 of Psalm 22 is a proclamation of the gospel, saying after the Messiah is crucified, there's going to be a proclamation of the gospel to all people. Look at verse 30 and 31. Posterity shall serve him. It shall be told of the Lord to the coming generation. They shall come and proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn, that he has done it. So that Psalm 22 ends with, now we're going to go out and proclaim this. We're going to tell the world, even people yet unborn, future generations, they're going to hear that he, Jesus, has done this. And this, of course, is a direct parallel to Jesus' final words in the Gospel of Mark, the Great Commission, where he says, go out and proclaim the gospel to all people, baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So again, Psalm 22, the entirety of it is an exact picture and fulfillment of what happens at the end of Mark's gospel. The reason that's important is because this: if Jesus' cry of forsakenness on the cross, when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? If that is viewed in isolation, if you say that has no correlation to anything else happening in Psalm 22 or in the Gospel of Mark, if we just view it in isolation, we can miss the full picture of what's happening in this moment. But because the conclusion of Mark's gospel seems to perfectly fulfill the entirety of Psalm 22, this statement that Jesus makes, my God, why have you forsaken me, was also an expression of his faith in God to bring vindication and deliverance after his suffering. It's not just about the suffering, it's also revealing he trusted that the Father would deliver him and that the Father would vindicate him after his suffering. So in this cry, as Jesus says and quotes from Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus was not only feeling the full horror of God's forsakenness on our behalf as he bore our sin, but he was also affirming his complete unbroken trust in the Father. It's a beautiful mixture, a beautiful paradox of both. He felt fully forsaken by the Father on our behalf, and yet fully trusting that the Father had a plan in this. And Jesus spoke of this earlier in John chapter 16, verse 32. Jesus knew that although he was going to bear the sins of mankind, that the Father would be with him. John 16:32, he said to his disciples, behold, the hour is coming. Indeed, it has come when you will be scattered, each to his home, and will leave me alone, which did happen. We saw that earlier in Mark. But look what he says. He says, yet I am not alone, for the Father is with me. So although he, yes, was forsaken, there is an element that we can't fully understand in that the Father was with him in the suffering. The psalm that Jesus quoted saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Verse 1, later climaxes, which is really interesting and culminates in verse 24. Notice what is said in Psalm 24, the second half. He says this, but he has not hidden his face from me, but has heard when he cried to him. So there's this interesting paradox here that Jesus was, yes, fully forsaken, and at the same time, he says, but he's not hidden his face from me. He had complete trust in the Father, which is why he was able to pray to the Father later and say, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. So ultimately, what I believe, and again, there is debate on this, and I'm totally open to conversation, and if you've kind of landed somewhere else, but what I believe, according to the fulfillment of Psalm 22, and as Jesus is quoting that Jesus' feeling of forsakenness was not because the Father actually completely abandoned the Son or turned his face away from him, as we often sing in that classic hymn, the Father turned his face away. I don't believe that that's actually what's going on here. I believe that Jesus' deep sense of forsakenness was not because the Father turned his face away, which we see clearly in verse 24 of Psalm 22, but because his sense of forsakenness was because it was God's will, it was the will of the Father for him to suffer and be crushed for the sins of the world. He knew that he had to go through that, and for that reason be forsaken on our behalf. And this is very clearly what Isaiah tells us prophetically. Isaiah chapter 53, verse 5. Listen to what Isaiah said. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. I believe that this is the forsakenness that Jesus was feeling, knowing that he had to go through this, knowing that he had to bear the weight of the sins of the world. Isaiah 53 verse 10 also says this, yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief when his soul makes an offering for sin. I believe this is the forsakenness, that Jesus knew that it was the Father's will that he be crushed, that he be absolutely crushed on behalf of our sin, that he be put to grief, that he, Jesus, his soul, would be an offering made for our guilt. I believe that is the forsakenness that Jesus was experiencing on the cross. We do know for certain, and all Christians can agree on this very clearly and emphatically, that on the cross, Jesus took the sins of the world. On the cross, Jesus took the cup of judgment. Jesus took the cup of the wrath of the Father. Jesus took the cup of suffering as a ransom payment for all the sins of the world, past, present, and future. That is the forsakenness that Jesus was feeling on the cross. He was forsaken on our behalf. We were forsaken without hope in the world until Jesus came and bore that upon himself. He willingly did that as a demonstration of his love for us. And I want to say that this is good news for us, you guys. That God was in Christ experiencing all of our God-forsakenness. That is a beautiful picture. Because when I look at me, and when you look at you, even though other people might not know what's going on, you look at yourself and you go, there's some pretty dark stuff happening in your heart. There's some pretty dark things in my life that people don't know. There's some things I'm wrestling with. And Jesus on the cross was forsaken on your behalf. Jesus took all of that for you. Jesus took all of that for me, which is such a beautiful message and is such good news. And this is good news for those as well who are here today and are experiencing maybe the dark night of the soul. Maybe you're here and you're feeling that God has completely abandoned you. You're in the hardest season of your life and you feel like God has forsaken me. There's definitely seasons of life where we all feel that. God, why have you forsaken me? But the cross shows us that in our most forsaken moments of darkness, in our darkest moments of grief and pain and suffering and abandonment, God is actually with us. He has not forsaken us because his son Jesus was forsaken on our behalf. Because of Jesus' unbroken trust in the Father, even being forsaken on our behalf, he still had trust that the Father had a plan. We can have confidence that God's vindication and God's deliverance and God's justice will always be at the end of our story. So if you're here today and you're just like, man, there is no hope for me. My life is forsaken. It's darkness covering my entire life. You can know that Jesus took that for you. Jesus took that upon himself on your behalf so that you can see Psalm 22 might begin with suffering, but it ends with vindication. It ends with hope. And we know that Jesus was faithful to fulfill that because he didn't remain in the grave. The payment had been paid and death has been done away with because Jesus conquered the grave. And he said, go and make disciples of all nations. And he invites us into that as the people of God. We're invited to continue in the expansion of the gospel because of what he did on our behalf. Isn't that beautiful? So, a little bit of, again, a long journey there, but I wanted to try and take some time to unpack that because there is a lot of kind of different viewpoints on that. And again, I'm totally open to conversation and feedback on that if you kind of grew up in different traditions. Continuing in the story, verse 35, it says this. Some of the bystanders hearing him say, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, why have you forsaken me? Some of the bystanders hearing it said, behold, he's calling for Elijah. And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink, saying, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down. And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. So some of the bystanders, because again, crucifixions were always done in public. When they heard him saying, Eli, Eli, they thought that he was calling for Elijah because there was a common Jewish belief that Elijah, the prophet, would return before the eschatological day of judgment. This was something that was a common belief among the Jews. And so they thought that Jesus was on the cross calling for Elijah, who, if you're not familiar with the story of Elijah, Elijah was taken to heaven in a chariot that was like sucked up by a tornado of fire. You can go read it. It's amazing. And And so they thought Jesus was calling for Elijah to come back down in kind of this tornado of fire and like swoop him up in the chariot and take him to heaven as well. That's kind of what they thought was going on here. Clearly not what's going on here though. We see then that Jesus, in verse 37, it says he uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. Now, Mark only records that he uttered some sort of loud cry and then he breathed his last. Mark doesn't record the details of what that last cry was, but all of the gospel accounts give us collectively 7 sayings that Jesus made on the cross. And in the Gospel of Luke, he says that these words, the last cry of Jesus, were, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," which would mean, again, that the Father actually was in some element that we can't fully understand present enough in the suffering of Jesus for Jesus to be able to actually speak to him and say, "Father, into your hands I'm giving my spirit." And John records his last words are, "It is finished." Now, the order doesn't matter. Whether Jesus said, "Into your hands I commit my spirit" last, or "It is finished" last, he did say all of those. And so what's amazing about this is the fact that Jesus uttered a loud cry in his final breathing moments shows us that Jesus did not die the death of an ordinary man who would be crucified, because the crucifixions were so long and excruciating, usually victims would have no energy and no breath left whatsoever. But the fact that Jesus had a final cry on the cross, whether the final word actually was, "It is finished," or "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," Jesus' loud cry at his death was a cry of triumph and a cry of victory, saying, "It's done. It's finished. I am committing my soul to the Father. I've borne the wrath of the sins of the world, and now I'm giving myself willingly back to the Father." It's a finished work, which is such a beautiful thing that although the death of Jesus in some way is a symbol of defeat, oh man, that he died, it's also a symbol of triumph and victory. That in his last moments, he was able to say, "I've done it. I've completed the race. It is finished, and I am giving my soul back to the Father." Really beautiful picture there. Now, after he said this is my favorite part. After Jesus said this, verse 38 and 39, look what happens. It says, "And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he, the centurion, said, 'Truly, this man was the Son of God.'" Isn't that beautiful? So again, immediately after Jesus cries these last words, "It is finished, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," we read that the curtain in the temple was torn from top to bottom. The top to bottom is significant and important. This was a heaven to earth top-down display of God's power. It came from the top and it went all the way to the bottom. Human hands could not tear this veil. This was a display of the power of God. This was supernaturally God himself tearing it from top to bottom, which is a really beautiful thing. Now, the curtain in the temple, which if you're familiar with the temple and all the rituals and exercises, the curtain in the temple, the purpose of it was to separate the Holy of Holies from the kind of common people. And this was no, typical bedroom curtain. The temple curtain in the Holy of Holies, most scholars believe, it was 60 feet tall. It was 10 feet wide and 10 inches thick. So this is like blackout to the max, right? Like this is the room you want to be sleeping in. But you're not allowed to go in there because this is, again, it separated the Holy of Holies from all the common people. Now, there was only one man, the high priest, one day a year, who after an extremely long and rigorous purification ceremony, he was able to go through the curtain into the Holy of Holies, where there he would offer a sacrifice on behalf of the sins of the people throughout that past year. Now, inside the Holy of Holies, as the priest would go in through the temple one day a year, there was the Ark of the Covenant. And inside the Ark of the Covenant, which was essentially, that was God's presence that led God's people through the wilderness. So God's presence was now in the temple. And inside inside the Ark of the Covenant itself, it's interesting, the children of Israel kept 3 things. They kept Aaron's rod, the 10 Commandments, and a jar of manna. Now, why would they keep all 3 of those things inside the Ark of the Covenant, inside the Holy of Holies? Well, all 3 of these things were direct signs signposts of Israel's past failures, which is actually really interesting, that these are the things God told them, I want these to be inside the Ark of the Covenant. Aaron's rod, for example, in the book of Numbers, if you're familiar with that story, God's people rebelled against Moses and Aaron, and they were complaining about their leadership, and God sent a plague that wiped out 14,700 of the people of Israel because they were complaining against Israel's leaders. And then God told him, I'm going to give you a sign. Have everybody from each tribe bring a rod. I'm going to give you a sign that shows you the person who I've appointed to lead. And in that story, Aaron's rod budded, which was God's way of saying to them, do not complain about the leaders who I've appointed. These are the people that I've chosen. So Aaron's rod was a continual reminder of their grumbling and complaining against the leaders that God had elected. The 10 Commandments, again, served as a continual reminder to God's people because none of the 10 Commandments were they able to fully keep. So this was God's perfect holy law. Here's the 10 things you're supposed to do. They were unable to keep those, and so those were put in the Ark of the Covenant as a reminder that, hey, you guys have failed. You guys have not kept the 10 Commandments as you should. Then finally, the jar of manna was again another symbol of Israel's grumbling and complaining in the wilderness. You guys might remember that story. They had failed to trust God's provision, and they were complaining, being like, we want to go back to Egypt because they had cucumbers and leeks. It was so good. And God miraculously rained down manna from heaven to be like, hey, stop complaining. I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to take care of you. So all three of these things inside the Ark of the Covenant were to remind Israel of their past failures. Now, what's so amazing is on top of the Ark of the Covenant, inside which was all three of these items, on top of the Ark of the Covenant was the mercy seat. And the mercy seat is where the priest would go and make the sacrifice on behalf of the sins of the people one day a year as he entered through the veil. The blood of the lamb that he sacrificed symbolically would wash over and would cover the failures of the nation of Israel, the rod, the 10 Commandments, and the jar of manna. And this is just a beautiful picture of what awaits us in God's presence in the Holy of Holies since the veil has now been torn. When we now come with boldness into the presence of God, into the throne room of God, we find mercy that covers sin, that covers our brokenness through the sacrifice that Jesus made. Isn't that wonderful? It's mercy that covers sin. It's the blood that covers the sin, and that is what Jesus was doing here on the cross. The temple veil was torn, and Jesus said, this is it. My blood is the sacrifice once for all. And when you come into my presence, you don't got to worry about your past failures. You've broken the 10 Commandments. You're complaining, all that. Mercy now covers sin when we come into the presence of God. And that's good news for us. That when we come into God's presence, we bring the 10 Commandments. We bring our complaining. We bring our sin. But when we come into his presence, his blood's already covered it. It's already a paid price, which is so beautiful. In closing, two things which are important on the torn veil. It's important to know, what did the torn veil mean for them in the first century when they heard the veils torn? What did that mean for them? And then secondly, what does this mean for us? So first and foremost, what did the torn veil mean for them in the first century when they heard the veil of the temple is torn? What did this mean? Three things. Number one, it meant the end of the temple sacrifices. Again, the temple was the place where the priests had to go to make a sacrifice to temporarily atone for the sins of the people. So when the veil was torn, after Jesus' blood was poured out on the cross, this was God's way of saying there are no more sacrifices that need to be made. You don't need to go and buy a sheep or a goat or a turtle dove and come and make a sacrifice. Jesus is our final sacrifice once and for all. They would have clearly understood this. Secondly, the veil being torn was a symbol of God's judgment against the temple and the corrupt leadership. If you've been with us in the Gospel of Mark, we see this over and over, that when Jesus went to the temple, he was overturning tables and he was driving people out. The leaders in the temple system had become corrupt. They were no longer actually ministering to people and allowing people to come in and encounter God's presence. They were pushing people away and they were trying to hustle and make money off of people. So when the veil of the temple is torn after Jesus is crucified, it was a symbol that God's judgment is upon this temple, which he said it would be. God is judging the wicked, greedy leaders of the temple who tried to use people to make money. And the veil being torn, by the way, as the people there would have been able to go and see in, it wasn't so much to say, look, here's God's presence. When they would go in through the torn veil, it was a symbol against the false leaders, the corrupt leaders, to say, look, God's presence isn't here anymore. He's not in here where you thought he was. He had left the temple. You guys thought you were doing all this and you could come in. No, God's presence is not in the temple anymore, which is the third part. The torn veil would mean that God's presence was now accessible and available to all people through the person of Jesus. His presence is no longer in a place. His presence is no longer behind the veil. It has been torn and exposed so that now all people can come into God's presence through the veil that was torn, which was ultimately his body. As his body was torn, the veil was torn, giving access to all people. So that's what it meant for them. It was the end of temple sacrifice. It was judgment on the temple itself. And it was God's way of saying, hey, all people can now come into my presence. The question now in closing is, what does the torn veil mean for us? And the great thing is we don't have to guess what it means for us because the author of Hebrews makes this very, very clear. So if you want to turn real quick to Hebrews chapter 10 in closing. And I want to read this passage, verse 19 through 25 of Hebrews chapter 10. This is what the veil torn means for us. He says this, "Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. And since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart, in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near." So what does the torn veil mean for us? Three things that we see very clearly the author of Hebrews says that this means for us. Number one is this. If you're a note taker, these might be worth writing down. Number one is this: intimacy. Intimacy. Because the veil has been torn, we have confidence, the author of Hebrews says, that God has invited us into his presence. It's very clear in verse 22. He says, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith. The implication for us is this: God is inviting us to come into his presence. He's inviting us into intimacy. He's inviting us to a relationship with himself. The veil's torn. He's saying, you can now come in. You don't got to wait for the one dude once a year. You don't got to wait for your pastor to come and pray for you. You can come into my presence, and you've been invited into that through the torn veil. Because the veil was torn now, any person, any day, any place, any time can come into the presence of God wherever you're at. The veil being torn shows us that every single moment is infused with the richness of God's presence. Any moment of your life can be a moment in the Holy of Holies. Whether you're at work, whether you're on your drive to work, whether you're praying in your bedroom on next to your bed, like any moment we have access to the presence of God. We have the ability to come and to press in to a deeper relationship to know him, not through somebody else, not because the priest said, hey, I did that, but because Jesus said, it's done, it's finished. And now the opportunity and invitation for us is intimacy. And so I want to just encourage you, man, if you're here today and you've trusted Jesus, you've trusted his work on the cross, but you haven't had that type of intimacy, you're fearful or afraid that like there's still some stuff between you and him, man, he said it's finished. You can press in. You can come near. You can come through the torn veil, not just the physical veil, but the veil of his body that was torn so that you and I could have access to his presence. Secondly, what the torn veil means for us is not only intimacy, which even if that's all we had, that would be enough, but we also have, number two, the torn veil means for us forgiveness. Forgiveness. Again, verse 22 says, our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed pure with water. Because Jesus tore the veil of the temple and because of Jesus' body being torn on our behalf, we don't have to carry the weight of guilt and the weight of shame and the weight of condemnation that comes when we fail to keep God's law. And we all do it. When you sin and when I sin and when I don't live up to the perfect standard of the scriptures, guess what? Guess what awaits me behind the veil? Forgiveness. Not just intimacy, but he says we have been washed clean. Our hearts have been sprinkled from an evil conscience. We've been washed pure with the water. Because of what Jesus did, we don't have to carry the weight of our sin. We've been forgiven because Jesus already nailed that to the cross. Your sin and my sin was nailed to the cross with him, and now we are completely forgiven. Just as the veil was torn, Jesus' body was torn so that we might pass through the sacrifice of himself and that we might find forgiveness and that we might be cleansed. Now, again, I know whenever you talk about forgiveness, there's always some people who say, man, that sounds really good, and I really want that. I want to believe that. I want to believe that I actually can be forgiven because of what Jesus did. But you just don't know me, bro. You just don't know my story. You don't know how far I've gone. You don't know what I've done. And the truth is this, I don't. But the truth is this, Jesus does. Jesus knows what you've done. And the enemy would love for you to believe what you've done is too far. You've gone too far. There's no way you could be forgiven. And the amazing thing is that at the end of this story in verse 39, and this is very intentional, the story ends with the Roman centurion saying, truly this man was the Son of God. Now, let me just tell you something. Let me point something out to you. The Roman centurion was directly complicit in the murder of Jesus. The Roman centurion is one of the few human beings in history who could literally say, I literally put Jesus on the cross. Literally, physically, I put him there. That's what I did. And yet, this man, a man who actually put Jesus on the cross, actually killed him. This man is the first person in history to confess, even in his death, this is the Son of God. Isn't that incredible? This is him. The man I just killed the Son of God. The man who had the most blood on his hands and literally put Jesus on the cross is the first man to find forgiveness at the cross. He's the first man to find grace. He's the first man to realize that what Jesus did is actually for him. He believed truly, I can be forgiven even though I'm the one who just killed him. His resume has any of ours beat, 100%. And he pressed in and said, I believe this. I believe he's the Son of God. I believe even I can be forgiven, which is so incredible. And so I want to encourage anyone here today who thinks, man, I want that, but I just don't know if I can. If you don't know if you can, man, look at the story of the centurion. God intentionally put this there for us to know that even those who we might think are the worst of sinners, are the farthest from God, there is hope, there is mercy, and there is forgiveness for all of us. We can all be cleansed by the blood that Jesus has shed for us on the cross. So the invitation is intimacy. Come boldly into his presence. The invitation is forgiveness. Man, if there's things and shame and guilt you're still carrying, trust that to Jesus. It's not about you being good enough. It's that he was the good and perfect sacrifice. And he already paid for all that, not because you were good, not because I was good, but because he's good and he loves us. And the third thing the torn veil means for us is simply this. It's community. It's intimacy, it's forgiveness, and it's community. Through the torn veil, we have been invited into an eternal community, not only with the triune God. Yes, we have perfect community with God now, but also into a community with one another. This is what he says in verse 24 and 25. These are the implications of the torn veil. Because of the torn veil, he says, let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. The implication here is because the veil is torn, what was once done in isolation, that was one man, the high priest, one day a year could come into God's presence. What was now done in isolation is now a communal family event. He says, let us not neglect meeting together. Let us come together in community. What the high priest did by himself, we get to do that together. The family of God coming to worship, coming to remember Jesus' sacrifice. This is now a family event. The old system was the high priest is in, he's special, he's got it together, everyone else is out. Sorry, no one else can come into God's presence, just me, the high priest, I'm special. That's the old system. The new system that Jesus established, it says the veil was torn and now all of us can come in. We're all invited into the presence of God. We're all invited into community as the family of God. And religion continues to try to sew back up that veil. Religion continues to say, these people aren't good enough. These aren't good enough. Sew the veil. Sorry, you can't come in. Sorry, you haven't got it figured out yet. Sorry, you got too much sin you're dealing with. Sorry, you got too many identity issues. Religion tries to sew the veil up and keep people out. And that's what all religion does. Sorry, you can't be a member here. Sorry, you're not good enough yet. Sorry, you think that, that's what religion does. It pushes people away from the presence of God. But the gospel says the veil has been torn, and now we all are invited into community with God and one another through the blood of God's Son, Jesus Christ. Isn't that wonderful? We need to be a church that stops sewing up the veil. And I'm not saying we do, but this in general, there's so many people who are hurting and broken, looking for answers, and they've been hurt by churches and Christians who try to sew the veil back up. You're not good enough yet. You haven't got that figured out yet. You better deal with that first. And Jesus says, come in through the veil with all your sin, with all your brokenness, and Jesus will work that in a person. Jesus will start to expose those things. But we have to be a church that says the veil's open. The veil's torn. His body was torn. The work is finished. And now our job is to love people where they're at, to let them come through the sacrifice of Jesus, to come through the open veil, not to re-sew it, not to say, here's all the things you have to do first, to just let people come in where they're at and allow Jesus, by the power of the Holy Spirit, to transform and to sanctify them. So I want to encourage us as a church. When people are coming in here, and they've got stuff and issues and things that are going through, and we all do. Just love those people where they're at. Let's say we're so grateful these people are coming in because the veil's torn, and that's what Jesus said. Let's let people come in, not push people out. That was the old system. New system is let's come in because that is the finished work that Jesus has accomplished on the cross. And again, this is what we do together. That's the importance. That's why we gather every week. Someone might say, well, why do you even do that? Because this is the new model. The old model was, hey, just the high priest, one day he gets it going. Now we get to gather and come together into the presence of God as a family and celebrate his finished work on the cross. Isn't that wonderful? So I want to just encourage you in closing today. If you're here and you haven't trusted in Jesus' finished work on the cross, you haven't understood the veil was torn for you, that Jesus actually wants a relationship with you. He wants intimacy with you. He wants you to understand you've been forgiven. He's invited you into the family of God. We are inviting you today into the family of God through the finished work of Jesus. That is available and free for any person here who wants it, because Jesus said it's finished. And if you're here and you have trusted that and believed that, we need to continue to press into these things. Continue to come boldly into the presence of God, not just one day a week on Sunday. Come boldly into the presence of God and find that place of intimacy. Continue to trust you've been forgiven, because we need that reminder every day. Every day I need to apply the blood. Wow, I've been forgiven. I'm so grateful for Jesus' sacrifice and community. Let us not continue and forsake neglecting and meeting with one another. We need this. And I'm real excited. Next month, we're going to do an entire series on community, because we're really sensing God pushing our church in a direction of deepening our relationships with each other. And so once we finish Mark, we're going to do that. I'm super excited about that. But let's continue in that. Let's continue to be a community and a people of people who keeps the cross at the center. Amen.